Invasion Audiobook, Part 24. It had been decided, sometime after sunrise, to head north, leaving to return to Joseph's old campsite, having been previously fled from, in order to avoid likely pursuit at the hands of their enemies coming after them from Butte. There was a purpose for doing so, as the troops of the National Militia paramilitary element of China weren't quite as heavily armed as were the PAP paramilitary forces, who now were themselves arrayed south and southwest of Bozeman, with their northernmost forces of the 27th PAP Light Armored Division taking up position around Bozeman proper itself, whereas the 4th National Militia Corps of the Ch1nese was indeed a sizable but drastically lighter combat formation, with only its anti-tank and air defense battalions armed with its heaviest weaponry, leaving the truck infantry battalions and single headquarters battalion over the whole corps with merely light infantry weaponry, mortars, and anti-tank missiles being among their hardest hitting of such, amid armored trucks and MRAPs with basic crew-served machine guns upon them also. These forces were highly efficient for the current mountain warfare now unfolding, having had trained on the Himalayan plateau of Tibet and mountains of Sichuan province, which made them already acclimated to such combat in particular. Of PLA regular military forces partaking in any such mountain fighting, there were their mountain and airborne units, which many of these found themselves further south in the Rockies or across the land in the Appalachian Mountains, further to the east of the continent. In areas such as southwestern Montana, along the state line with Idaho, the forces of the Light National Militia 4th Corps were themselves, even as a third-tier unit of the Chinese, adequate for their current task. As it related to the Americans resisting them, fighting these Chi-Com forces in particular was drastically more favorable than fighting the heavier PAP and also PLA units, or even the Russians who sat across the state line over in Idaho. There was no time to rest for the Americans, and it was agreed that a regimen of steady relocation should be pursued, as there was a requirement for now seizing enemy resources in order to even survive, leading to such a policy of random nomadic movements to begin with. As for Joseph's role as a leader, he, along with the Guards Major and Troy, were now the new leadership council of their group, and thus shared operational control over their now combined forces. There were sub-leaders of such coming from Joseph's miniature understrength companies, as he called them, along with the right-hand men of Troy's group, and the lower-ranking officers who survived the Billings battle in Montana, whereby the 1st of the 169th was totally routed, leaving few survivors remaining of the squadron, which itself was the equivalent within cavalry elements as a battalion in terms of its overall size. Only 110 scattered men from the different companies and one artillery battery comprising the Cav squadron, the first of the 169th, managed to flee the clutches of the entire 7th Group Army of the PLA, a massive 50,000-man strong formation within the PLA itself, one of many such group armies. The PLA's forces further to the east in Montana had already cleared large swathes of territory, cleansing it of all American military assets and the civilian populations there, and continued to occupy that very ground, leaving the mountains largely to the PAP and National Militia paramilitary forces currently occupying that region. As the men and their families tagging along set up their new campsite, with many of the combat forces rapidly working together to start digging in, Joseph, the major, and Troy all began to plan their next course of action. With so many men, all working to dig trenches, bunkers, and foxholes together in their now hundreds, this took merely a few hours to construct a decent campsite, well protected by the encapsulation of the myriad of new earthworks. Joseph decided to move a bit further north to scout his old campsite, to survey the damages there. Part of his conscience told him to not go. However, he opted to do so anyhow. His popular mental perception telling him that the trip was worth finding out clues as to the size of the forces that had been tailing him and the others, no doubt, earlier, sometime after the cessation of the enormous artillery barrage and tactical airstrikes had occurred. He felt that he could examine the area for boot imprints and wanted to see if anything had been done to the bunker system, which he had the foresight and the wisdom to impose the creation thereof, which had saved lives that otherwise would have been obliterated by the withering artillery and air power unleashed upon them. Joseph grabbed a handful of his own original men for this endeavor, telling them that they were about to conduct a long-range reconnaissance patrol into the forest to the north, essentially inspecting their recent campsite for a damage assessment now that the sun was up and it was able to be seen properly. It was close to noon now, and the men now set out on foot. There were some 50 total, and they were armed with an assortment of small arms, leaving their best captured weaponry behind, only bringing 2 machine guns and a few grenades and Molotovs just in case. Even so, it wasn't expected to encounter any heavy enemy forces within this particular area, as they were now miles away from the PAP troops and in the zone of the National Militia troops, who were unlikely, for the time being at least, to be in the forest. Or were they? Joseph was smart, militarily speaking, but he wasn't fully realizing that the local Chi-Com forces did have plans to clear the local wilderness areas close by to Butte, the hometown of Joseph and his wife Sally, among all the others of his original armed group and their families. His reconnaissance in force he'd done the night before hadn't done much damage overall, as it was more a psychological blow to the local Chi-Com forces than an actual death blow, per se. It didn't, in fact, cause the Chi-Coms to be knocked off keel from their already planned combat operations. It merely simply informed them that there were resistors close by who needed to be dealt with, hunted down, and either captured or killed. Of all the types of Chi-Com forces, the National and Marine militias, respectively, were by far the least oppressive and most humane, as these were largely conscript formations of third-line paramilitary, a national reserve of sorts, of enormous numbers of combat forces and auxiliary troops made up of part-timers who lived within their communities like regular military reservists and could be called up for national defense. But were called up in this case to partake in the invasion, as the numbers required for a nation of the vast size of America called for in some places units to fill specialty voids created by the vast size and varied terrain features therein. Thus were called up specific units of some of the enormous quantities of home defense paramilitary troops, in particular those who had mountain training, to help patch up areas whereby the tough terrain and topographical features of the Rockies required anyone who could conduct the operations there most effectively. 4 corps of the National Militia Paramilitary were operating in the Pacific Northwest, with also 1 corps of Marine militia on the Washington coast upon the Olympic Peninsula. These coming out of the multiple millions strong national and marine militias. The PLA mobilized many reserve group armies in conjunction with its active armies, group armies, to rotate through the theater of war that was America, along with ample PAP forces from their 1st and 2nd mobile contingents, which held massive corps-sized forces of their own. All in all, massive quantities of the various Chi-Com forces were engaged in subduing and occupying the land. Even was the National Construction Corps also involved, essentially a paramilitary version of what a regular army's combatant and civil engineers entail, insofar as their tasking and capabilities and job description. Joseph and the other men set out upon their mission. So far, so good, at least for the time being. But the plans of the enemy were unfolding already. They had begun upon the cessation of the barrage and use of air power earlier, whereby they not only had sent out pursuit forces after Joseph's group, who had already fled out of the area, they now were sending out regular patrols to hunt for partisans should they somehow return to the area. While doing so, the general in command of the whole 4th Corps itself was actually creating Operation Woodsman, whereby a large sweep involving 2 whole battalions of truck infantry was to occur after a series of initial patrols had concluded. The patrols would help ascertain what kind of enemy forces still lingered in the forest, as well as their capabilities and even potential sizes. This intelligence was to be used to tailor aspects of the coming operation, as the operation was to be somewhat flexible. The senior general, a 3-star in command of the whole corps, was to oversee all aspects of the unfolding operation, which was now in its first phase with the patrols that were sent out, almost like feelers on an insect or crustacean. Were it possible, the patrols would score a major success were they to be able to capture any enemy prisoners of war in any combat encounters out in the field. The large forces, who predominantly were drawn from those within the immediate area of Butte itself, as the rest of the 4th Corps was embroiled in combat largely along the state line area. and was now dealing with the remaining pockets, as well as hunting those who managed to somehow avoid outright encirclement, were the two truck battalions of infantry who provided the local combat forces around Butte for the headquarters battalion itself, which was largely an administrative and logistical force for the 4th National Militia Corps. These were they who'd be launching the assault into the forested mountains and local valleys upon the completion of their patrols. Joseph and his men now were reaching their old area wherein they'd previously established their old ad hoc campsite of earthen bunkers and trenches, along with some foxholes intermixed amid these. The forest was largely eviscerated in this particular area as a result of all the heavy shelling and airstrikes having just occurred, some of which involved napalm strikes. It was a desolate appearing landscape now, of splintered wood and trees missing their tops. Little of what once was the forested canopy even remained, as very few trees still stood unharmed. The ground also was cratered and ripped up. The area where their bunkers were established was now being approached by them, all as the silently moving Americans swiftly and quietly moved ever closer, now minutes away from the old spot at their current brisk pace. The damage guided their path forward, as entire swathes of the forest had now been destroyed. Their last known home sat within the destruction. Some nearly 20 minutes later, they were now within view of the bunker and earthwork site. As the men slowed down to a bit more of a creeping pace, there then came a loud blast. One of the men had stepped upon an anti-personnel mine, leading to him flipping backward in the air, losing his left leg, with the right one now maimed severely. He now lay there, bleeding out profusely, and screaming the scream that could only be heard in one's worst night terrors. The scream of abject, helpless, agonizing pain. "These sons of bitches mined our home!" yelled Joseph, before then yelling, "Watch your step! Don't let yourself become victims! Someone help him!" It was too late, as the man who'd stepped on the mine now passed away from the shock and severe blood loss in mere minutes after having lost his leg. The other men, now fearful of suffering similar, began to get onto the ground and crawl around looking for other mines, as Joseph told them all to do so. And if any more were found, to dig them up in order to later use them for their own purposes. The noise of the mine's detonation and the yelling had alerted a Chi-Com patrol close by to the area wherein Joseph and his men now currently sat. This was developing into a dire situation indeed, as the men were about to be dealing with worse than just mines. The Chi-Coms on patrol were about 800 meters away and knew where they'd planted the mines, basically all over the old earthwork area of the Americans who'd earlier abandoned them, fully anticipating that some might return, most likely, of course, being they who had previously inhabited the primitive bunker structures. The forces nearest to the Americans were armed with Chinese Type 56 rifles and Type 81 light machine guns, along with standard grenades and a few Type 69 RPG systems. It was a typical infantry platoon of forces from one of the local truck infantry battalions currently in Butte, coming from one of the battalion's 8 different companies. There were 40 men of this platoon that would be encountering Joseph and his remaining 49 men. Well, 50, including himself. The odds were somewhat even in terms of the quality, experience, and arms of the men. However, the Type 69 rocket-propelled grenades of the Ch1nese made up for there being 10 less men of theirs who'd be fighting the Americans. Also, the fact that the Americans might be trapped inside the kill box of all the well-planted anti-personnel mines perhaps could also add to the overall circumstances potentially favoring the local Chi-Com forces in the immediate vicinity. However, that would have yet to be seen. The approaching Chi-Coms now ran in 4-column formations, each column comprised of 1 squad, 4 in the platoon. As they got closer, they formed into squad-sized wedge formations from their current line formations to go on the attack. They began to peel off now, splitting up to where the 4 squads would be coming at the American position within the mined earthwork complex on 3 different sides. However, this being done in such a way as to where all the sides of any potential retreat could thus be fired upon by the Chi-Coms, but without also causing any friendly fire due to how the wedges were arrayed and in what direction whereby they aimed all their weaponry. Just then, it began. Light machine guns began firing. It was the Type 81s, as their rounds splashed all over the ground, which, not being level ground, of course, by any stretch of the imagination within the forested mountain foothills, were full of all manner of topographical features, and with the previously dug-in earthworks, were still somewhat useful as different types of cover and concealment, provided the mines were avoided, having been laid throughout the former home of the American group of Josephs. The men had already dug up multiple different mines upon carefully extracting some from the ground before the Chi-Coms arrived, some even out of old trenches and foxholes, although mines couldn't be cleared from the bunkers, as the dark bunkers inside would have been too risky and dangerous to even attempt to clear such deadly devices in such conditions. While the Chi-Com wedge formations began their attack, the Americans conducted their very own tactical formations, breaking into star formations to move throughout the various topographical features and rough cratered terrain from the earlier shelling and airstrikes. These star formations made it easier to aim lower into the sloped approaches now being climbed slightly by the Chi-Com paramilitary troops as they advanced towards them. Joseph fired his AKM, which he got back from Sally, instead giving her the Springfield 30-06 this time, which was a great choice, considering the ammo and magazines of the Chi-Com Type 56 rifles were interchangeable with it, which would end up being quite helpful within the scope of this particular battle currently now unfolding. The others fired their weapons back at the Chinese troops, who now dropped behind the cover afforded them by the craters and also rocks and soil formations of the varied topography, along with miniature ridge lines and ravines and ditches spread throughout the slopes and hilly area of these foothills. The men of Joseph's small force were spread out and within some semblance of tactical formations, mostly star and diamond formations, which he could see as he glanced quickly all around him to get an idea of the current tactical situation, in order to know what he was up against, as well as what he was now working with in terms of his own men and their current status. They were also aware to the point where they made snap decisions which appeared to be working for the time being, with the couple star formations of 2 teams of 10 men off to his right firing down at the Ch1nese, hiding in a ditch some 90 meters or so away, thus pinning them down for the time being. Also to the left was a diamond formation of about 15 of his men that formed up as such in an attempt to hold their left flank of the entire group, while he and others in the center on lower terrain were all firing down the middle. As it related to the diamond, it was an excellent choice, as they inadvertently prevented anyone from being able to sneak around the entire group on that side, as they held a full-on 360-degree security perimeter, which watched all sides, even behind them all. The star formations on the right did similar, though on a smaller scale, but were adequate in that being at a slightly higher point of view over their particular battle space was a great tactical formation for downward shooting. Hand grenades were deployed, whereby the Chinese tried to break the current stalemate of the basic exchange of fire that had been happening back and forth so far, with no clear winners as of yet, as even by 7 minutes into the exchange, no one yet had hit anyone on either side, even despite the fact that the proverbial wall of lead exchanged back and forth was now splashing the ground all over the place, but with close calls occurring whereby rounds did smack the dirt sometimes fairly close to the intended recipients of such brutality. Blasts of the recently tossed grenades occurred, but they too fell a bit short of their targets, the terrain having had aided the Americans yet again. However, the National Militia troops were about to up the ante and deployed their 4 Type 69 systems they had with them, with anti-personnel rockets loaded. They fired a volley of 4 to begin with, which all crashed into the ground, and one hitting the base of a shredded-up tree which had been ripped to pieces during the earlier shelling and airstrikes. Shrapnel from these rockets claimed the lives, so far, of 5 men. It was enough to aid the erstwhile pinned-down Chi-Coms to press a new assault, which they did, whereby 2 of the 4 squads in their wedge formations pressed their assaults once more on the edges of the Americans, while the 2 stayed in the center and continued to maintain their current positions. Each of the 2 squads on the edges moved forward in an attempt to get beside the Americans before reorienting their firepower upon them to where they'd be able to hit them successfully from 3 directions as they originally intended, leading no doubt to the defeat of Joseph's group, should they be successful. On the right, the 2 star formations were now each halfway depleted of men, as the anti-personnel rounds of the RPGs largely ate away at their numbers, cutting them in half due to 5 each of the original 10 comprising each of the 2 star formations, having not hit the deck fast enough the moment the RPGs were fired, which itself led to their demise by virtue of the shrapnel. The others fell down immediately at the sight of the RPG men raising up to fire at them, rolling down beneath the berm they'd just then been standing on. The angle that the rockets impacted upon the berm KIA'd the 5 left. That enabled the two squads of the Chi-Com platoon on each outer edge to attempt to move forward to outflank the Americans, as they'd managed to gain a slight advantage with this development. However, as that occurred, the 5 remaining men of each of the 2 star formations went to climb back atop the berm once again, where they'd been moments ago, but stopped just high enough to maintain cover against the Chi-Coms that now advanced on their right flank. They fired their rifles, and one his light machine gun, a captured Type 81, at the Chi-Com paramilitary troops, hitting 3 of them. They'd managed to spot blood spurting into the air as they hit them as they ran, aiming for them as they tried passing in front of them while running toward their right-hand side from where they aimed. They appeared to have clotheslined them while they ran with the rounds, hitting them in their necks or heads. It was hard to tell, as things now moved extremely quick, and things seemed like a literal blur of different actions taking place. The Americans, holding the center of their positions, kept firing at the 2 squads of Chi-Coms currently facing them. The Diamond on the left side had meanwhile been fighting the other squad trying to outflank them on their whole left flank. That squad stopped and dropped to cover upon taking intense fire from the men that were arrayed in the diamond formation of the Americans. Just then, grenades were exchanged, whereby the American men in the diamond tossed 2, and the men of the Chi-Com squad trying to go around them did the same. All detonated, with yelling heard coming from the Chinese side, with also the Americans yelling that one was quote-unquote gone and several injured, and that aid needed to be rendered immediately. Of course, the men brought basic first aid supplies for treating wounds, but supplies were limited, and so were some of the weapons brought along, like grenades, a delicacy unto themselves insofar as the total combined numbers of such owned by all the amalgamated American groups now unified into one. The original 50 men of Joseph's group, along with him on this recon patrol, only brought perhaps 5 or so total grenades, and 2 had just now been used, leaving only several left, with some Molotovs as well. One Molotov had already been tossed by the men of the holding up the center of the whole group of Americans, of which 10 now shifted to the right to make up for the 5 deceased of the one of the original 10-man stars watching that side. This now left 15 in the middle, with 15 on the right, and now 12 remaining of the diamond on the left. The fatalities and wounded thus far were now some 9 total, including the mine victim. More was yet to come, as the firefight was literally only minutes old now, as these things always happen in rapid fashion. Of the Chi-Com platoon, they'd suffered similar losses, though a few less than the Americans by this point. Death loomed around every corner, or in this case, every tree stump, ravine, and rock formation. The Chi-Coms in the center fired more anti-personnel RPG rounds, 2 of them towards the Americans in the center this time, who avoided complete catastrophe by dropping as low as possible, leading only to shrapnel wounds upon one of the men instead of many being instantly KIA'd due to being in the path of most of it. As the rockets crashed into the top of the miniature ridge line atop the ditch the men were currently taking cover within. Machine gun fire continued to blaze throughout the whole area. The Chi-Coms on both flanks, left and right, once again bounded. And though the ones on the right side made it to cover safely, the ones on the left lost 2 more troops who'd been badly shot up. The rest began to toss several more of their grenades at the Americans currently holding the diamond formation, this time wiping them all out, as the grenades had been cooked this time for a few seconds, giving literally no time whatsoever for the Americans to react. The remaining men, including those recently wounded, were all blasted to literal and figurative pieces. This left open the center, with Joseph included, now vulnerable to being outflanked from the Chi-Coms moving around the left side of the Americans, who now swung into position and attempted to fire upon Joseph and the others there. However, Joseph and four others turned to meet the threat, firing back along with tossing a Molotov, which lit one of the attackers ablaze as it crashed and fire erupted, scattering the others who sought to avoid being burned severely. This allowed for a temporary reprieve while Joseph shot one of those who scattered by the hands of the incendiary weapon in the back, hitting him in his armor, but also in the shoulder and even finally in the head, as he pumped out several shots from his rifle. While the first shots weren't deadly, it was the final ones that did in the Chi-Com, as the Kevlar helmet at that close a range, merely some 100 meters away by that point of running, could not withstand the hits from the AKM's rounds. The men firing on the left faced their own challenges, but fought valiantly. They managed to take out one more Chi-Com on that side, as Joseph yelled to retreat, albeit whilst conducting a fighting retreat. The men all formed up into a large single rolling diamond of the survivors, with the ambulatory wounded protected in the middle of the whole formation itself. The men, all while shooting, formed up into such, and with their interlocking fields of fire, watching all sides, allowed for them to fend off a final determined attack by the Chi-Com paramilitary troops, albeit at the cost of one more American life to Chinese fire. But the Chinese also finally broke off the attack, having to tend to and evacuate their own wounded personnel. Also, while the Americans fled, they lost their final loss of all. One last man became another mine victim, stepping upon a mine prior to exiting the whole overall area, sending him into the air and snapping his neck upon landing on the ground, eliminating him instantly, while wounding the man also to the left and the other to the right of him in the diamond formation upon this occurring. However, due to being spread out a bit, the wounds on the two others weren't too severe. Instead, fairly minor wounds sustained in the legs. While they'd been confined to their relatively small positions during the engagement, they'd been trapped within an area they'd managed to demine a little bit before the encounter with the Chinese forces. But they couldn't demine the entire area, especially while leaving in such haste from the kill box. Joseph learned a bitter lesson from this short engagement. He should have listened to his gut instinct, because good men were badly wounded or eliminated outright from that engagement, with nothing to show for it, apart from finding out what had happened to their recent former home. It had been turned into a death trap by the enemy, along with the fact that the enemy had taken to now patrolling the forests and foothills, a completely unexpected development, but one by which would spur on newer, more radical decision-making processes. Things were about to change drastically, as the stakes were now higher than ever in this area. As Joseph and the others hurriedly fled the area, upon getting far enough away to where they could now break formation and start bolting away, running at a sprint. They could hear helicopters moving into the area behind them as they ran. They kept running at a fast pace, as they had no way to know what the helicopters were armed with, if anything. However, fortunately for them, these were not attack helicopters, but instead were Russian utility helicopters moving in to conduct a medevac of the wounded Chi-Com paramilitary troops, and also to remove the deceased among them as well from the rapid firefight that had just concluded. The PLA had aviation assets of their own close by, but due to the high level of activity in the region, even by day 3 of the invasion, Russian helicopters of the VVS, the Air Force of Russia, had to be called upon instead for rapid medevac operations in far-flung forested mountain regions along the state line area. Unlike most other armed forces around the world assigning their helicopters to their armies, the Russians predominantly assigned their rotary aircraft to the Air Force, the VVS. Mi-17s now circled the area and would hover near to the ground where they were missing trees from the earlier barrage and air attacks to use as their LZ to allow the Ch1nese paramilitary troops of the platoon of National Militia Forces to lift up their injured and deceased onto the low-hovering utility helos, whereby the Russian flight medics would care for the wounded until they could complete their RTB, their return to base, thereby making it back to the coalition FOB over in Idaho, freshly established, currently manned mainly by Russian forces in this particular FOB of the 49th Combined Arms Army, but also a detachment of Ch1nese paramilitary of the National Construction Corps as well, who constructed it along with Russian Army engineers, both building the FOB together. Joseph took no chances with he and his surviving men and kept moving as fast as their legs could carry them, before finally returning to the new campsite, which sat now at a higher altitude further up the mountain than was where he currently was upon managing to retreat to live on to fight another day. Fighting was continued to rage onward, as Ch1nese National Militia troops of dismounted truck infantry battalions raced up the mountain slope toward the peak of the mountain, having had nearly by now reached the very top. Blasting and ripping of small arms filled the once quiet mountain air, as there was now no escape from the horrors of vicious combat, a situation that several days ago on October the 3rd, no one could have even fathomed. Many had been annihilated by this point, with the remaining Americans in the area now hunkering down in various natural positions upon the summit itself, an area of some roughly 250 acres spread out in a long and somewhat narrow line along its top. The diversity of the terrain and topographical features in general up there afforded defenders excellent protection, and had saved some earlier from everything from airdropped to howitzer fired all the way down to smaller mortar-launched munitions. By the edge, defenders firing down at the now bounding uphill Chinese forces were being hit by various ammo and shrapnel from grenades and other weapons, causing them to be thinned out. Although more had taken up positions further away from the edge of the summit, including Bill, who for his part ran through many different rock formations and past several pines that grew atop the mountain here, and ran toward the destroyed remains of the survivalist's cabin, as it was obvious that the annihilated cabin with no driveway, or much less any roads nearby it, was just that. A cabin built by someone originally to get away from the rest of humanity, with all of its flaws. However, humanity now arrived upon the summit with a vengeance. The cabin had been leveled to its very foundation by the earlier air and artillery strikes upon the peak, which left very little to nothing of the former structure, minus a small sort of root cellar, which had, interestingly enough, been carved right out of the rock itself. Truly, whomever constructed this building had put some years of immense time and effort into its construction, as it lay in a very remote and challenging environment. Perhaps it was someone's personal project, maybe a hobby, and now it was gone, just like that, taking mere seconds to destroy by whatever munition landed close to it upon being fired or either dropped. Bill ran to it as rounds now splashed all around the peak itself. They'd just come over the crest and were now opening fire everywhere. Americans fired back vigorously as they had little other choice but to continue giving it their best, or their all, as it were. Bill stepped upon the former floor of the destroyed cabin, whereby only small pieces of the walls remained at the very bottom of the former structure, and boards had been strewn about with the former contents of the building all throughout the peak, scattered, as blasts had tossed it all to and fro as if it weighed nothing at all. He got into a crouching position, now partially shielded somewhat, and concealed within the gouged out and gutted former building. He spotted some of the Ch1nese, now making it atop the summit, and opened fire upon them, but hitting none of them, as their swift and rapid movements made them daunting targets at that distance to have even a chance of hitting them. This, as they also dipped and dodged all the fire by disappearing into natural ditches and ravines atop the summit, and behind berms and boulders which partially helped to form natural trenches and other forms of different cover and concealment positions. There came more and more, reaching the peak. The exchange of fire now picked up drastically, and Bill began once again to get low on ammunition as he expeditiously changed magazines while conducting tactical reloads. He knew he needed either more ammo or to find another weapon with ample amounts of it for it. Bill now ran out from behind his former cover point and ran down from the higher point of the rocky topography upon which the ravaged remains of the cabin sat. Various rounds smacked into the rocky soil and rock formations, tossing up perilous, splintering debris and pebbles which turned into harmful projectiles. All around were men firing from behind their various cover points, rising up every so often to properly aim, or at least attempt to do so. Many lay dead throughout the combat zone, as they'd been simply wiped out by an array of different weapons. Some done in by shrapnel, many by the impacts of bullets of several different calibers, ranging from 7.62 by 39 or 54 to 12.7 millimeter. These national militia troops used the older Type 56 and 81 rifles and light machine guns as these third-rate home defense paramilitary units, similar in their mission to what the American National Guard was, only paramilitary, were generally the last to have new weapons proliferate down to them, as regular military, including even the reserves, got first priority for brand new weapons, then the PAP, finally down to the enormously massive National Militia and Marine Militia forces, as well as the National Construction Corps, who all combined formed nearly 16 million men of the total 20 million man paramilitary forces of China, an enormous force unto itself, and a whole separate parallel military structure apart from its regular military. Apart from those numbers, the remainder was the PAP and PLA strategic reserves, which came under military from paramilitary control in times of war, as these were the backup reserves to the normal massive reserves of the regular military. Though these particular units didn't utilize the newest 5.8 by 42 millimeter weapons like the regular military and most of the PAP forces did, their 7.62 by 39 millimeter rifles were still plenty to do the task at hand. Just then, some anti-personnel rounds from Type 69 RPG systems crashed close by, one killing three instantly where it erupted upon smashing into the rocky ground. It had been fired by enemy troops who'd raised up on top of a berm-like rock formation some 250 meters or so away before rapidly dropping to the ground to take cover upon firing their devastating weapon. There were also even more potent anti-tank missile systems being fired in addition to the RPG rocket systems, like the Ch-08s, even some single-tube fired HJ-10 Red Arrows, as they were called, which were even more powerful than the 08s or the 12s. These weapons threw around all manner of rock and debris with their shredding shrapnel pieces upon impact, and eliminating many defenders whenever caught inadequately protected. There were also mortars raining death from above, which was extremely unsettling for many Americans, which inadvertently aided the Chi-Com attackers by causing many to remain low for too long, whereby the National Militia troops could take longer bounds to different cover points that were closer to the American positions, allowing for the Chinese to close the distance with their enemies, making it then possible to be able to fire at them even more accurately, as they would then have clearer sight pictures by which to be able to have a higher hit probability against the Americans when utilizing their rifles. Bill found a man who had an AR, finally, as he'd passed others equipped with mostly hunting rifles and a few with battle rifles in the AR platforms, and some with SKSs and AK platforms. He begged the man with the AR for a few mags, but the man had no loaded magazines he himself could spare for Bill. However, he did quickly hand Bill two large Ziploc baggies filled with 5.56 millimeter ammo. He yelled something over all the ripping small arms about it being 300 rounds. Bill graciously nodded over all the cacophony as he turned to retreat back to his last position at the cabin's foundation. He would have to load all of his empty magazines fast with the rounds he had just then received. He hated that he had really no mags fully loaded and ready, apart from the nearly 20 rounds left in the one he already had in his rifle's magazine weld. He stayed low upon returning and began with very shaky hands to load up his 5 magazines he currently had on him, all empty. It took him many minutes to do so, as people perished under fire left and right, as the Chi-Coms slowly began to advance to clear the mountain's peak. By this point, there were perhaps just under 250 Americans remaining in this area, as the pocket had been methodically and brutally crushed bit by bit, with Chi-Coms now bisecting the pocket into two by using a road in a close-by mountain valley to drive their vehicles in a straight line upon the road to block the Americans on both ends of the pocket from being able to reinforce one another or to possibly escape by the remaining forces somehow linking up to attempt perhaps some sort of ad hoc organized breakout move. Earlier fleeing wounded, having headed down the other side of the mountain, which was currently under assault, had largely been intercepted by now in the valley, whereby many simply surrendered as there were no other choice. They'd receive medical attention from the enemy, but they'd never be truly free ever again. Bill didn't know this, nor did any of the others on the peak, still currently fighting. Bill finally completed his magazine loading task, leaving half of the 300 rounds left in the Ziploc bag. He went back to the grisly work of brutal combat as he fired savagely upon the Chi-Coms any time they revealed themselves while advancing. He managed to hit several, but he wasn't sure if they were KIAs or WIAs, or perhaps a combo thereof. He witnessed a whirlwind of fire continuing to be exchanged within this brutal and unforgiving instance of harsh, vicious, brutal combat. The National Militia troops had by this point set up heavy 12.7 millimeter machine guns on tripods their troops had carried to assemble once upon reaching the summit. Alongside their already operational anti-tank missiles, and of course lighter Type 69 rocket-propelled grenades operated by many of their troops. Also, mortars still continued to rain down upon American positions to boot. Be all of that as it were, the Americans continue to try to hold out with great endurance, as these hardy mountain people had more heart than most of the American population, staying in the fight and using their own small arms, but also whatever captured Chi-Com weapons they'd been able to thus far obtain in the conflict, aiding them greatly as they tried once more to hold out against all odds. One had a captured Type 81 light machine gun, and fortunately had multiple drum magazines that went with it, using the weapon to great effect, holding back a localized enemy assault within his specific zone. Some others had captured grenades and even several RPGs that had been taken amid average captured small arms, all of which definitely aided the defense. Even so, many fell in battle and continued to fall, as rounds continually splashed into the ground and into bodies, causing multiple fatalities. Little by little, more and more of the remaining defenders fell, as the seemingly endless ammo and munitions continued to come upon them as a complete wall of destruction. By this point, there seemed to be a temporary stalemate, but Bill knew it wouldn't last, as the Chi-Coms had temporarily taken up positions behind cover and concealment, merely to regroup for their next push, as had been the case multiple times earlier. After all, despite the fact that Bill himself wasn't a soldier, he'd been around war veterans and also learned the ebb and flow of combat situations by now fairly intimately. And he could fully ascertain the realities of what was currently inbound based simply upon all that he'd undergone by this point. Rounds smacked into the area of the cabin, as he'd only moved really one good time to pursue ammo minutes earlier from the man he received the 5.56 from. For only 40 minutes, the Chinese paramilitary forces had been fighting upon the mountain's peak itself, from the time they'd come atop the crest of it until Bill began taking direct fire levied against his position. Of course, he wasn't the only one up there on that particular higher ground. Others were close by, taking cover amid the rocks and few trees up there around the cabin area, and laying in the prone position in low-laying topography within the elevated ground whereby sat the cabin's remains. Of those around Bill's current position, they all numbered some nearly 40 people, mostly men and a couple women, who used the naturally fortified high ground as a superb fighting position by which to fire down upon the battlefield as a whole that was the entire summit. Interlocking fields of fire was what the Chi-Com aggressors now had to overcome, as the Americans actually managed to pull off a rugged defense, whereby on sheer initiative and solid wisdom, They'd used the land to their fullest advantage. Chi-Coms had lost perhaps a platoon's worth of men upon the summit itself thus far, once they'd entered. But American losses were perhaps several times greater and would continue to mount. The grueling battle continued as the two sides fought like punch-drunk boxers, slugging it out with one another. The Chi-Coms fired from behind good cover, as did the Americans, but the added weight of the mortars used, along with the sheer volume of machine gun fire with anti-tank missiles and lighter rockets from the Type 69 systems, all added up to enormous amounts of ravaging firepower. Bill fired his rifle, rapidly pulling its trigger to send as many rounds as he could downrange, just to try to get the enemy closer to American positions to keep their heads down. Bill wasn't alone in this, but ammo began to be tight all around in general, as the Americans only had so much and lacked any sort of formal logistical networks, nor did they have the actual quantities necessary for a prolonged fight. Captured Chi-Com weapons, while immensely helpful, were still somewhat limited as well overall. Bill, once again, by the time an hour had fully elapsed, insofar as the fighting atop the peak was concerned, Bill reloaded his empty mags upon burning through them once again. He now loaded the last 150 remaining rounds from the Ziploc bag, fully realizing there weren't much left overall between all the remaining living American defenders, and thus would only be from now on taking well-aimed shots in order to conserve his ammunition. Bill and the surviving defenders braced themselves for the inevitable. The big push to take and clear the whole summit to be conducted by the Chi-Coms. The sun had already begun to rise, and it was now mid-morning when it occurred. The next in what would be a string of assaults to seize and clear the entire peak, beginning with the rattling of the reoriented heavy machine guns, along with general purpose and also light machine guns, intermixed with the firing of mortars, now guided by quadcopter drones deployed as spotters to relay the accurate coordinates of any discovered American positions, all while more rockets out of Type 69 RPGs, along with anti-tank missiles now being fired in carefully organized salvos, whereby volley after volley of such systems were deployed and fired to where it kept the heads down of those clinging onto positions that were intended to hold until the last possible moments. After all, nobody wanted to surrender or imagine life in the clutches of the Red Chinese invaders. Thus came a cacophony of blasting so loud, even the now somewhat seasoned Americans began to lose their nerve here and there, as the savage firepower now unleashed upon them was worse than earlier, while gradually retreating up the slope all the way to the top. Bill now was laying face down while covering his head as mortars landed way too close for comfort, as the saying went, all while 12.7 millimeter rounds cracked upon striking the rocky soil nearby, with occasional loud thud-sounding strikes upon sometimes blowing out pieces of the very minuscule portions of what remained of the wall of the destroyed cabin structure. This, as wooden pieces were ripped right off of it, barely above Bill's head to boot. Had he raised up even a few inches, his head quite possibly could have been blown into literal pieces, hunks of bone and brain matter sent scattered throughout the immediate vicinity. Moreover, this exact fatal end had already occurred, with several close by where Bill currently lay. Minutes into this new push, much of the heavy volleys of mortars, rockets, and missiles finally began to calm down some, affording Bill the option to get up and move, which he graciously took the opportunity to do. Instead of staying upon the higher topography wherein sat the bare bones remains of the old cabin, he ran quickly now before dropping down a several foot tall drop into a ravine which offered much better cover, dodging machine gun fire the entire way into it. Others who followed suit upon seeing the vulnerability of the position, upon surviving the heavy wall of lead unleashed upon them by the reoriented and massed machine guns, perhaps a dozen or so, didn't make it, leading to them being lit up and smacked into multiple parts of their bodies by both 12.7 millimeter and 7.62 by 54 millimeter rounds from both heavy and general purpose machine guns, respectively. Upon the men running being cut down by the machine guns, their bloodied and mangled bodies in some cases fell atop one another, whereby those sprinting being hit kept momentum slightly to where their bodies fell forward to where they slumped upon each other as if a line of dominoes had fallen. The bloodied corpses were a gruesome sight to Bill, as the first in the line of those following behind him, who had perished in the aforementioned manner of being machine gunned, rolled off to the side, as that man had fallen quite close to the edge of the several foot drop of the rocks and into the ravine, which Bill had taken to get into it, thereby falling mere feet away from Bill where he hunkered down, with Bill bearing witness to the man's frozen last facial expression, eyes still wide open and gaping out, with mouth wide open, left that way from the yelp of pain emerging upon being hit throughout his torso. Also, the last breath having been drawn into his opened mouth. It was a facial expression transfixed by both their last moments of life being that of a severe, agonizing pain, as well as the fighting for air from the shock and internal bleeding. Bill momentarily fixated upon the shredded torso of this man and was struck by fear of similar possibly occurring to him, reminding him of just how high the stakes really were, and that the defenders realistically wouldn't be able to hold out forever, leading to him experiencing severe doubts immediately, while also wondering what the future held for him personally. Up until this very moment, Bill hadn't had time to experience such internal mental conflicts of conscience. However, he was staring death in its face, both literally, but also metaphorically speaking, while looking at the man's frozen facial expression and its twisted horror. Indeed, what would he do? Moreover, what could he do? He looked at his body, his clothing, and even his own arms. All were blood-stained from the fighting and deaths having it occurred around him throughout this entire battle on this mountain up until that point. Upon fully realizing how his clothes had been splattered by all those hit all around him, he began to experience a mild shake within his body. He then shook his head rather violently to shake away the negative thoughts and doubts before once again shouldering his rifle, before turning to raise up to only eye level to look atop the ravine to see where the enemy was, and thus take aim upon them wherever and whenever spotted. The several quadcopter drones were weaving and bobbing overhead as they were being fired at by the Americans. Most got the hint immediately. These drones would deliver death from above, providing the battlefield intel and accurate coordinates of the defenders' positions, leading to accurately fired mortars and other weapons deployed on the current battlefield, all going for them, accurately so. Bill aimed upwards, realizing that these absolutely needed to go first, or else to ignore these could lead to his very own demise. End of part 23. 24.